Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Tiffany, retired librarian turned homeschool mom. And in this video, we're going to look at the last book in the Apprentice series by John Flanigan. If you have not seen the rest of my reviews on this book series, please go back to the beginning, otherwise this will not make sense. So, we're going to be looking at, this book is different. This is a series of short stories that kind of answers a few questions, fills in some gaps, and finishes things off. So this book is called The Lost Stories. Now what this book does is something very, very interesting. This brings the stories into reality. It starts off with an archaeologist who's digging through what is the remains of Castle Redmont. And he has a student, and he's obsessed with these rangers and these stories of Halt and Will and Horace and these legends, and he connects them kind of to Arthurian legends. So one of his students finds what amounts to be the remains of Halt's or Will's cottage, and they find underground buried a bunch of sheets of paper which are the lost tales. Essentially they fill in some of the gaps, and the professor essentially says, this tells us what happens after essentially the last book in the series, and some of the things that have happened. I think there was some earlier ones, but again, so that's what this is. It's a series of kind of these lost tales. You get a variety of things. One of them is kind of fun. The author once got a letter from a female fan in New Zealand talking about the horses, which are very important. The rangers have these very specific horses that are trained to do all sorts of things, to walk quietly, to follow all sorts of very specific commands. But she mentions, like, these horses would only be able to be in service for 14 to 15 years, because they also have to be adult horses and thoroughly trained. So like, what happens when they have to retire? So in this story, essentially what happens is Will's horse, Tug, gets bit by a wolf, and he has to take him to the breeder who got him, and basically to get him healed. And the healer loans him another retired horse, and he's a lot slower, and he's kind of older, and when he brings him back, and it has them talking to the horses in their heads, which isn't something that's ever fully explained. I'm not sure they're actually, basically they seem to be answering back. They have close relationships with their horses. So he comes back with this horse and realizes, and Crowley's there. Crowley is the head of the Rangers Corps, and they have to explain to him that Tug needs to be retired. And what happens is he's put into the breeding program, and they change his name, and basically the horse picks his name, and they get, and when Will was coming, he saw a much younger horse that looks identical to Tug, and essentially that name, in the case of the Rangers' horses, is just passed on to their next horse, which looks almost identical and is fully trained. So, and his horse, Tug, gets a new name, which I can't remember what it was very long, and he goes into the breeding program and essentially goes into retirement. And the horse that Will had borrowed briefly had been Crowley's old horse. And so it goes into the explanation. The reason Crowley is there is because this kind of accelerated Tug's retirement. So normally what they would do is they would explain this slowly and slowly get the young ranger, when they had to change horses for the first time, ready to do this in a little bit more of a slower manner. But Tug was injured, and it's kind of time for him to retire and go into the breeding program. And Will takes this new horse. So that's kind of an explanation there. One of the other stories explains Halt's background and kind of a look at where the country was prior to King Duncan taking the throne. Essentially, Duncan's father was a good king when he was young, but he slowly kind of became weak-minded and was basically surrounded himself with dukes who wanted more power. The Rangers kind of started falling apart and became more of a social thing for second noble sons, and the rangers who had been trained properly the way Crowley was, were, in particular Crowley's mentor, where they had the 5 years of training and they were an elite force, were slowly being chased off. Duncan, who was then the heir to the throne and a prince, was essentially exiled off to some random fief in the middle of nowhere, and because these barons had convinced the king that his son was not fit to rule. And Mograth, who I'm mispronouncing, this is how he slowly comes to power. And this kind of is a little short story kind of explaining this. Crowley's unhappy because he's still one of the elite and he's been sent off to the middle of nowhere. And his mentor had been chased out of the country on trumped up charges, and a lot of people had. There weren't many properly trained rangers left. And he's in a bar one night being harassed by some of Mograth. I can't pronounce his name. He's the big bad guy from the beginning of the book series. This guy, he's still, has a land and everything. And Golan, which is where the ruins is where they handle things late in the first book. And he's basically being harassed, and he's rescued by Halt, who still has a heavy accent from his home country. And he knew this is where Crowley's mentor had gone, at least briefly, and trained Halt how to basically be a better shot, and trained him quite a bit on this, basically the art of moving in silence. And he befriends Crowley, and he kind of helps him and injures these men, who they then take back to Mograth thinking he's going to punish them. He doesn't. Basically, he's a dick and kind of does a lot of threatening things and tries to get Halt on his side, and Halt pretty much, no, not interested. So Halt and Crowley leave, and then after they part ways, because you kind of get the background, Crowley telling Halt what's kind of going on in the country, and Halt saying, why don't you just get the rest of these rangers together, get to the prince, and try to take back the country. And he's like, that would be trouble. But then after they part ways, and I think Halt's heading to Celtica or something, and basically he senses that something's up and goes back and rescues Crowley from essentially being attacked by Mograth's men, and they end up killing them. And he's like, you know what? Crowley's like, maybe you're right. I think that's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna go gather the rest of the sane rangers, and we're gonna go to Duncan, and we're gonna try and take things back. And it's like, do you want to come along? I'm like, you know what? Halt's like, yep. How about I do that? And that's kind of the end of the story. So you get the first how Crowley and Halt meet and the state of the country when Halt arrives before, war, and the country gets taken back. And it doesn't really explain how Duncan's father dies, but he's old and feeble. So that's one of the other stories. The other one is actually kind of interesting. When Halt and Will are together, you still get a little bit more background on Crowley. This is, they're dealing with moonwreckers, I believe is what they're called them. Similar people exist. Essentially, they're land pirates. They coax ships onto rocky ground and then rob them. And so Will and Halt, these guys have kind of showed up again, and they go to basically deal with them. And Halt kind of talks about how him and Crowley, after the war, cleared off a whole group of these, just the two of them. So you hear a few war stories and basically explanation of them dealing with this. One of the other stories is kind of interesting. Will comes back from a mission, and his dog Ebony has been stolen because Alice left her, she's still a puppy, outside the cottage, and they realize it's been stolen by the country's version of gypsies. And Will and Alice have to kind of go, and these guys do horse dog fighting, and they essentially have to go and get Ebony back and eventually chase this country's version of gypsies out of town, or out of the country entirely. I'm trying to think of they also have part of the whole moonwrecker wrecker thing was he's the best man in Horace and Cassandra's wedding, and he's tried to do a speech, and it kind of ends with him trying to basically use a lot of big words. And basically he's driving Halt crazy. And then in the end of this, before he gives the speech, in the act of dealing with these Moonwrecker, he throws the entire speech accidentally with his pack into a fire. And Halt's like, just speak from your heart already. So that's part of that. Then the following story right before the wedding, because the wedding is actually taking place at Redmont rather than at the palace, partially because Cassandra wants things a little bit more intimate. So, but the steward of the castle goes to Will and it's like, there's been some bizarre accidents going on. So Will goes to investigate and deals with a fired steward who is basically being snobbish, and essentially figures out, yes, this is he's been sabotaging things because he's pissed off. And then he's poisoned. And Will's trying to figure out, okay, what the heck is going on? Who would poison him? And who are these names? And eventually figures out that there are assassins going to be at the wedding. And he's able to, with the help of some Scandians, take care of the assassins, though he thinks they're going after the king. And of course they get one of the assassins alive. Halt kind of interrogates them. It's like, yeah, the reason they were doing this at this time, because Will's like, it's like, why didn't they do it here? And they're like, that's because the target wasn't the king, it was the princess, because she was basically, they're pissed off at her for, I believe this has to do with Eric's ransom. The guy who they ended up sending to prison escaped. So the head of that country, who basically had sent him off to prison, is now pissed off because he's there at the wedding. And basically they just wanted revenge on Cassandra, not to mention to send the country into turmoil because she's the heir to the throne and there are no other children. So that's the other kind of story you see, the wedding. Alis gets slightly irritated because Will almost misses their dance at this wedding. Apparently he missed it at the dance at Halt's wedding. You know, the other wedding where I believe he was a best man. Could have been wrong. But yeah, so he's getting slightly in trouble. And then it ends essentially with, the last story actually has to do with Gillian. So you have a little bit of what the heck one of the stories of what the heck Gillian's doing when Halt is off trying to rescue Will and Evelyn in Scandia. So you find out him hunting down a person who was working with Mongarath. I'm mispronouncing this guy. So you get that whole story of him doing some subterfuge there. So you find out with Gillian. And then the second to last story has to do with Gillian as well, and his relationship with a young girl by the name of Jenny, who is actually another ward mate and friend of both Will and Horace's and Alis's, and George, who's periodically brought up. I don't think you hear about George again. But he's kind of, because he's been spending a lot of time at Redmount, she runs a restaurant. And she comes home one day. Normally she spends a lot of time at her restaurant, but she's planning on cooking dinner for Galen. Or Gillian. There's these guys who they've been watching her house, and they know it's going to be empty as a place to hide out after they rob a silversmith, which they do. And then she's, however, home. They show up, they're angry, they get mad at her, and they're planning on, I don't know if they're trying to kill her or they don't know what to do. They've done this in broad daylight. So it's like, we can't really leave, and they're fighting. And then Gillian finishes work early, and she's mentally been kind of beaten up a little bit to reveal that, yes, her ranger boyfriend is coming. Because she gets very, very mad because they destroy the tart and the food that she's been doing. He gets home early, she's kind of battling them, and then essentially Gillian kills them. I believe he kills them. And you kind of get their relationship there. So that's kind of where you're getting a little bit of her backstory and them falling in love. And they've had set this up previously, so it's not coming out of left field. And then you kind of get basically the final, you get the wedding of basically Gillian and Jenny, and Halt and Alis do a wedding, basically a combined wedding, where essentially they do kind of a justice of the peace thing. Though Cassandra is the maid of honor for Alis. So she does walk down the aisle and everything. And that's pretty much the end of the series. It ends, the final part of it ends setting up his next series, which I believe is the Brotherhood Chronicles. So, and that's what this sets up. So this book sets that up. I'm going to click here. I have not read these books. I will read them later. I'll probably do videos on them. I didn't really know what they were. So, and this, it sets up the story of, apparently, this legend of a Scandian Arloon mixed kid and his knowledge of seafaring. So that is the end of the Ranger's Apprentice series. You have, this kind of ends with a bunch of little short stories and background stuff and kind of closing, answering some questions and tying off loose ends. So I don't know if you ever haven't figure out what happens with George. I'm sure he just kind of remains a lawyer. So, but again, I highly recommend this series. This book again is like kind of little short stories. It kind of finishes things off. The rest of the books are very battle focused and epic kind of quest things of you're doing a variety of different things. Check out the rest of the book series, my reviews. Highly check out the book series, even if you see these reviews. I don't reveal enough, even though I kind of reveal the endings. There's a whole bunch of stuff in between that I do not reveal here. Partially because I, as a dyslexic, I skim through some of this stuff. So I do not have all the details. And I've only read them once as opposed to some of the other books that I review, where particularly with Tamora Pierce, I've read those books multiple times. I know them by heart. So this is a really quick overview. But that is it for this review and the covering of the Ranger's Apprentice series. If you like what you've seen in this series of reviews, be sure to check out the rest of my channel. I am covering some Tamora Pierce. I cover a bunch of children's books. I cover some homeschooling stuff, some travel stuff, and a whole bunch more. So be sure to check out the rest of my channel. Thank you.